We know what they disagree on, but the two US presidential candidates actually seem to be on common ground when it comes to the Middle East. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have both pledged their full support for Israel. So what does that mean for the Palestinians? And is the US even still interested in the peace process? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. In about a week, the United States will have chosen its next president. And we all know the story by now, one of the most divisive and controversial election seasons in recent memory, dominated by scandals rather than policies, and disagreement on almost all domestic and foreign policy. But the one thing Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump seem to agree on is their unwavering support for Israel. Both have met the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and pledged full support for his government. During their campaigns, the two candidates promised to continue supporting Israel's military, which already gets more US foreign aid than any other country. And both candidates have blamed Palestinians for inciting violence in the Gaza Strip. Now, to illustrate the point, it's best to hear from the candidates themselves. So here they are, addressing the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that is AIPAC, back in March.
America can't ever be neutral when it comes to Israel's security or survival. We can't be neutral when rockets rain down on residential neighborhoods, when civilians are stabbed in the street, when suicide bombers target the innocent. Some things aren't negotiable. And anyone who doesn't understand that has no business being our president.
The Palestinians must come to the table knowing that the bond between the United States and Israel is absolutely, totally unbreakable. They must come to the table willing and able to stop the terror being committed on a daily basis against Israel. They must do that.
All right, let's bring in our guests to discuss this. First of all, in New York, we've got Elie Jacobs, a supporter of Hillary Clinton and co-founder of JNFuture, that is the Jewish National Fund's youth leadership group. Then in Washington, D.C. is J.D. Gordon, national security and foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump and a former Pentagon spokesman. And in Amman, Jordan, rounding out the panel is Moin Rabbani, senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies and co-editor of Jadaliyah, an online magazine focusing on Middle East politics. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. To me, the central issue, and this is what I want to get your views on in turn, to me the central issue here is words versus actions. If you look at the Obama administration, and if you just looked at the words that they'd said over the last 8 years to Israel, they're very strong, they're tough, but the actions don't back that up. Let's start with you, Elie.
Sure, it's good to be with you and good to be with the other panelists. I think that's really an important point that you just made. One of the big complaints that some Israeli supporters have had about the Obama administration is the way they talk about some of the issues. Not necessarily that they've done anything that's different, breaking from any of the traditions going back 30 or 40 years by American administrations. And that's a significant issue that the action hasn't changed. Some of the language and the verbiage used to describe some of it and some of the solutions, that has changed mildly. I think what we'll see with Secretary Clinton or if Mr. Trump should win, you'll see a shift probably back to the kind of rhetoric and the language used pre-Obama times.
JD, don't tell me you're going to agree with Elie as well and that we're all going to agree at the end of this.
I agree with him, and I agree with you for the most part, Kamahl. I do think that when you have rhetoric that is fairly anti-Israel, I'd characterize it as, when President Obama says things like, well, Israel should go back to the 1967 borders, which we all know are militarily indefensible. When he says that, I think that incites the Palestinians to think, hey, we've really got them on the ropes now, so let's go for it and let's be even more violent. So I don't think that the rhetoric is helpful for President Obama. That said, I think Hillary Clinton would be better than President Obama. So at the end of the day, I agree with you guys.
But you believe Trump would be better still?
I think he'd be better because he also pushes back a little harder, I think, against Iran in the Iran deal. Mr. Trump said that we have to renegotiate that deal with Iran, and really we have to stop Iran's nuclear capability, and that means we have to stop their uranium enrichment. Any country that can enrich uranium can develop nuclear weapons. In fact, all 13 countries that enrich uranium all have nuclear weapons or are covered by the U.S. nuclear security umbrella, except for Iran. So that's the big deal, the Iranian nuclear program. And Mr. Trump would be tougher than Secretary Clinton, in my opinion.
And we will discuss Iran a bit further. I'd like to bring in Muin Rabbani in Amman. JD said there that the rhetoric has been anti-Israel. And I think that's sort of what I was alluding to as well. But again, does anti-Israel rhetoric amount to anything if no actions are taken?
Well, you listen to your previous guests, and you would think that the U.S. under Obama is the Fourth Reich. I mean, let's be serious. Obama will go down in history, as all of his predecessors during the past few decades, as the most pro-Israeli president ever, and he's proven his credentials, most recently with a $38 billion 10-year security agreement with Israel, through defending Israeli impunity in international fora and the like. And the next American president, whether Trump or Clinton, will, I'm quite confident, leave office also with the accolade of being the most pro-Israeli American president in history. I mean, the issue here is that there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States of more or less uncritical and unconditional support for whatever policies Israel chooses to implement versus the Palestinians.
But Muin, could we even go further to the point and say that actually the US president, whoever he or she is, be it now, in the future, in the past, they don't actually decide the policy on Israel-Palestine. It's almost an enshrined thing which doesn't change.
Well, in a sense, that's essentially correct. I mean, U.S. foreign policy is determined by institutions and elites and all the rest of it, and and the role of the presidency is not unrestricted in this, and so I think barring very unusual circumstances, I wouldn't expect all too much difference from the next American president. And so, Trump can go on about how he will renegotiate the agreement with Iran, as if that's even possible, and about how he will overhaul U.S. foreign policy, but that's simply not going to happen. Hillary Clinton, by contrast, is very much within the bipartisan American consensus on policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is basically one of increasingly unconditional and uncritical support for Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank and its periodic murderous military assaults on the Gaza Strip on the one hand, and defending Israeli impunity in those actions and shielding it from accountability on the other. So I basically agree with the premise of your question.
Okay, I think this is a good point to raise with Elie in New York, because when Hillary Clinton, or when the party platform was being negotiated for the Democrats, there was a call for, and I'm quoting here, an end to occupations and illegal settlements. I think that was raised by Bernie Sanders. The Clinton team rejected that, said it was too strong. Now, an article I've read about that is actually saying that puts her, Hillary Clinton, further to the right of George W. Bush, which I'm pretty sure is where a Democratic nominee doesn't want to be.
Well, it's stated American policy since Lyndon Johnson, since post-67, to oppose development in the settlements. That doesn't mean that the U.S. has enforced that as rigorously as some on the left may want, but it is stated American policy. I don't know that putting that Hillary would be to the right of George W. Bush based on that assumption. But going back to a point that JD made earlier about the Obama statement that the 67 lines with agreed swaps, which is the second part of the sentence that JD left out, would be the basis of the negotiations for creating a Palestinian state, is also pretty much enshrined in American policy. It was part of the Clinton parameters, it was part of Bush's 4 pillars, and it's been part of the Obama strategy as well. So when you talk about settlement development, while any American administration, Trump or Clinton, is not going to be in favor of it, the reality is that the agreed swaps will be in the areas where there are the most densely populated developments, which are mostly along the borders or the at some point in the future borders of a Palestinian state.
Okay, gentlemen, we're just going to pause for 1 second because I want to go back in time a little bit. When it comes to foreign policy, Hillary Clinton often points to her time as Secretary of State, the 4 years she spent as Secretary of State. So we just want to examine that record very quickly. There was the ceasefire she negotiated between Hamas and Israel back in 2012, which did calm the escalating tensions there. Could have turned into another protracted war, costly war there. But more long-term, things aren't so successful. Clinton did reopen the peace process in 2010, but the talks dissolved within weeks. As we know, she's always stood by Israel by pushing for stronger sanctions against Iran, which she says poses a serious security threat to Israel. And as part of the Obama administration, Clinton protested against Israel's settlement expansion, but then backtracked slightly after she left office, which we just talked about. Donald Trump's record, we should point out, a little harder to judge since he's only been a politician for a year. But his stance on the issue has changed several times. Last December, he said he would be, quote, neutral while negotiating a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. He even suggested Israel might have to, quote, sacrifice certain things. But in March, he said that it's probably not possible to be neutral, and by May, he'd said Israel should continue building settlements in the West Bank. Since then, Trump's advisors on Israel have said he'd probably support annexing parts of the West Bank. They've also encouraged him to reject the idea of a two-state solution. And in September, Trump promised to formally recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. JD, that's a total 180. Why?
Well, Kamahl, that's an excellent question. I think that over the course of the last year, Mr. Trump has learned a little bit more about Israel and the situation there, and his views have evolved. Being in New York, you hear a lot of different opinions about what should happen with the Israelis and Palestinians, and I think what he was saying back last fall was indicative of the debate you hear in New York. We should be neutral. We should make sure the Israelis and the Palestinians are equally compromising. But as he got to learn over the last year, the Palestinians have never agreed to anything. When Elie in New York talks about the agreed land swaps, well, they're agreed by the Israelis, but not the Palestinians. The Israelis have to keep a military presence in the Jordan River Valley because if King Abdullah should fall someday or another government takes over in Jordan, it would be suicide, essentially, to not have troops there between Israel, between the West Bank and between Jordan. Okay. So the Israelis are adamant about that, and the Palestinians are not compromising. So Mr. Trump has learned that.
Forgive me being blunt here, JD, but isn't it also about getting Jewish support at the ballot and financial support as well?
Kamahl, I'm really glad you brought that up because actually this is more about evangelical Christian support. Evangelical Christians are over 90 million in America out of our population of 320 million. The Jewish population is about 6 million. However, the Jewish population is very divided about what to do about Israel. And in fact, you have leaders like Bernie Sanders that are much more pro-Palestinian. Two of the big kingmakers in America, the billionaires, the kingmakers, the people who pull the levers of power. George Soros is Jewish. He's a leftist. And then Sheldon Adelson, he's a conservative. Well, he's pro-Israel. So you have two of the most important kingmakers in America, both Jewish billionaires. One's pro-Palestinian, one's pro-Israel. So this is much more about the evangelical Christian vote, because I tell you, for the evangelical Christians, and I was Governor Huckabee's chief foreign policy advisor for well over a year, that was one of Governor Huckabee's #1 issues. And so it's more about the evangelical Christian vote than the Jewish vote.
Quick word with Elie before we go back to Muin Rabani. Elie, can I ask you about Hillary Clinton's record, which I mentioned just earlier? Because as we stacked it up there, in her years as Secretary of State, didn't amount to much.
Well, again, I think that part of the issue is that she's a Secretary of State. She's implementing administration policy. Sure, she had a role in it, but at the end of the day, the president makes the call and she has to go out and implement it. I think that the sanctions that were started to be put in place by the Bush administration in 2005, that Secretary Clinton was able to ratchet up into global sanctions, were really the issue that put the squeeze on Iran to start the ability to start having the ability to negotiate on their nuclear program. She's come out and said repeatedly that the agreement is far from perfect, but any arms control agreement is far from perfect. And she's said repeatedly that she will vigorously enforce it, that she takes the position of distrust and verify, and that there need to be clear consequences to any nefarious action that the Iranians take. Those are positions that are to the right of what President Obama has said publicly for certain. I also believe that some of the points that JD was just making, to go back to a point he was making in terms of the evangelical vote, were pretty spot on. The Jewish community in America does get a great deal of attention on Israel issues, obviously, but it's truly the evangelical base that JD alluded to that is more of a driving factor on the Republican side of the electorate.
Mouin Rabbani, let's bring you back in, because both our other guests have mentioned Iran, and I'd like your view on that as well. Now, if Donald Trump favours scrapping the Iran deal, he was never in favour of it. So if he doesn't want that, isn't that something which should technically be more in line with what Israel and its people want?
Yes, except the problem with Donald Trump is he's an empty vessel. I mean, we have no clue what he actually thinks and believes about these various issues, primarily because he doesn't have a clue. And you gave the example of the various positions that he's taken on Israeli-Palestinian issues and how he's been all over the place. One of your previous guests suggested this was an evolution on the basis of him coming to the conclusion that Israel needs to be in permanent occupation of Palestinian territory. I think, if I recall correctly, his initial position was that only he could successfully negotiate an Israeli-Palestinian peace, and his current position is that only he can prevent the eradication of Israel, which would be certain to happen if he loses the election. So, I mean, it's very difficult to take this childish narcissism in any way seriously. Now, as far as Iran is, or the Iranian nuclear agreement is concerned, my understanding is that Trump has not stated that he would tear up the agreement, but rather renegotiate it. I mean, is this serious? Does anyone really believe that Iran and Russia and China and the European Union and Germany are going to accept a renegotiation of this agreement? It's simply not serious.
JD, apparently your man's an empty vessel and childish narcissism and all these things. Your response?
Well, I'd say that a country that can elect Barack Obama can easily elect Mr. Trump. I mean, Barack Obama, if you talk about empty suit, so to speak, I mean, this guy came out of nowhere, state senator for a few years, a U.S. senator for a few years who usually voted present. I mean, this guy is like a Soros-driven puppet in many ways. So I think America elects a person based on their level of political celebrity. Any country that can elect Obama can easily elect Mr. Trump.
Okay then. Mouin, I will come back to you just quickly because there was one more thing I wanted to ask you about relationships in the Middle East. We've obviously focused a lot on Israel, but is the relationship of either Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump with the Palestinian leadership relevant here? We don't really address that very much.
Well, in terms of Trump, to the best of my understanding, he doesn't have any relationships in this part of the world, save his one meeting with Netanyahu. Clinton, of course, has a larger set of relationships there, dating back also to her time as First Lady. But I think, I think this issue is fundamentally irrelevant. The real issue is whether American policy will continue not only to accept, but in practice to enable Israeli colonial expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and its military assaults on the Gaza Strip on the one hand, and secondly, whether it will continue to promote Israeli impunity and lack of accountability in its dealings with the Palestinians. And my sense is that absent a concerted effort by either the Palestinians or the Arabs, who of course are now highly preoccupied with other issues, or from public opinion in the West, including in the United States, that's going to remain unchanged. I mean, we've seen some encouraging signs, I think, in the past several years. And getting back to one of the points one of your previous speakers made, I completely agree. Israel is a much more significant issue in 2016 to the evangelical Christian community in the United States than it is to the Jewish community, for example. Youth and college students and so on are on the whole significantly more neutral or pro-Palestinian than they have been in previous decades. So there are encouraging signs, but it requires a lot more work and more time.
Right, gentlemen, we're starting to run down the clock, so just a couple of quick final questions. And Elie Jacobs, I'll come back to you in New York first of all. Hillary Clinton, she was Secretary of State, obviously. Her replacement was John Kerry, who tried very hard at the start of his tenure to get things moving on the peace process, but then even he seemed to really give up. So two questions here. The first one, will the appointment of the next Secretary of State be important? And two, will the US even care that much, given, as we've pointed out, there are so many other issues on in the world, Iran, Russia, Syria, and all these other sorts of things?
So first off, I think it is an issue that the Americans care about. Mr. Rabbani did mention some polling data that indicates that younger people are not quite as attached to Israel as older generations. But the bottom line is that there is a deep, unbreakable bond between Israel and the American population. So I firmly believe that. What does that mean? I think that means that there are shared values. There's a shared vision for its place in the Middle East.
Those are meaningless cliches.
How are those meaningless when you agree on values and you support someone because they're your staunchest ally in the region? How are those platitudes?
We're not talking about a romantic relationship. We're talking about states and state interests.
Sure we are. It's
They don't
international
have unbreakable
diplomacy.
Bonds.
Absolutely you do.
Unbreakable bonds don't exist in international diplomacy. I'm sorry.
Oh, this is interesting. I wish we'd started this earlier because we could have kept going for a while on this, but I'm going to jump in just now anyway because, as I said, the clock is running down. JD, what do you think about this? I mean, is this something which American public even cares about and which policymakers will care about? I just feel that there's so much else happening in the world these days that the Israel-Palestine issue, which is central to the whole Middle East, has just dropped right off the radar.
Well, Kamahl, you know, I agree with Elie there. There is an unbreakable bond, I think, between the United States and Israel as long as our demographics remain the way they are. I do agree with Moen and the fact that he said that a lot of kids on campus these days are much more Palestinian. And that's a reflection of money being spent by guys like George Soros to push this BDS type agenda. So, yeah, I mean, it's all about, at the end of the day, I think, special interests, money. Always follow the money is what I say.
Okay, Moen, 60 seconds left. Final word with you.
Look, I mean, you know, when you listen to the way American politicians talk about Israel, take the Obama administration. The chief accusation against Obama was not that he wasn't supportive of Israel, but that he didn't love Israel, as if somehow the President of the United States should have an erotic relationship with Israel. You know, rather than one based on a cold, calculated assessment of American strategic interests in the Middle East. I mean, that's how far gone the narrative in the U.S. Has gone. It defies logic and imagination. And, you know, Trump keeps saying the U.S. has been turned into a global laughingstock. Well, he's right, but it's precisely because of people like him and the kind of, you know, meaningless cliches and rhetoric that we've heard in this program that that's the case.
And on that note of an erotic relationship with Israel, I think we'll leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time. Do appreciate it. Elie Jacobs, JD Gordon, and Moen Rabbani. And thank you as well for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. You can see the program again anytime or any of our previous ones as well by visiting aljazeera.com and going to the programs section. Look for Inside Story there. For further discussion, of course, there's our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well at AJ Inside Story. I'm at Kamahl AJE. From me, Kamahl Santamaria, and the whole Inside Story team, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.